Thank you. Thank you for your introduction, and thank you, Gisela, Diane, and everyone in CELCE for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be part of these workshops. I really enjoyed last week, and I'm delighted to be here today. As Janet just explained, I am involved in many projects related to Galician culture. I am based in Ireland, and kind of I suppose both Galicia and Ireland are places which are important in both my research and my creative practice. And the book that I'm going to read from today in many ways reflect that. I have a brief presentation that I want to share with you. It's just a couple of slides. It's just a couple of slides, really. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, good. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about my aspects of my work that have a relationship with the ideas of place and nature. I particularly want to highlight some historical instances of the close relationships and the interactions between place and nature that are present in Galician literature. And then so this will be kind of a general introduction, and then I will illustrate the discussion with a poem from Diario de Cross Screen. So just very quickly, I want to kind of do like a tour down memory lane through Galician poetry and its relationship with place and nature. Since the early days of the medieval Galician Portuguese poetry, the presence of place, nature, and the environment has been central to Galician culture. Sometimes it was as a static element, as background, and therefore without agency, but more often than not, it performed kind of more active and more relevant forms and functions. I'm thinking, for example, of poems from the medieval tradition that interrogate the lands, that pretty much question the different elements of nature, or that they talk to the sea or to different attributes of nature. So there is a kind of a very clear engagement with nature from this particular tradition. Other times, the natural environments can be used as spaces for encounter or for celebration, as it happens very often in other medieval traditions. In Galician literature, we had to wait then until the 19th century for Galician poetry to adopt new articulations of its interaction with the natural world, particularly by the authors of the so-called Rexurdimento, which was the revival, cultural, political, and linguistic revival that took place in Galicia from the mid-19th century onwards. And we have examples such as the poets Eduardo Pondal and Rosalía de Castro, who was our foundational poet, whose work engages with nature very, very closely. And just to give you an example of that proximity, the Galician anthem is a poem of based in a composition by Eduardo Pondal, the 19th century poet, and it's called "The Pine Trees" or "Spinos," and it's a constant kind of interrogation to the trees about what we are, who we are as a nation. And so we could, talk a lot about this engagement because it was very fruitful in the Galician tradition. The 20th century saw the emergence of new ways of relating to nature, of writing the land, so to speak. And literary historians have used different labels to talk about different sorts of engagements with nature and the land. And so we have labels such as landscape poetry or rural poetry, poetry of the land, And this kind of engagement with nature adopts a variety of forms and styles, ranging from realist depictions of the landscape and the value of the simplicity of peasant life to the telluric communion with the natural world, or even with particular environments. And jumping to the 21st century in Galician, the greatest revolution of these few decades has been the emergence and the consolidation of women poets. And what is interesting about this emergence is that women poets also write the land, or should I say that they rewrite the land, because the work of many of these poets stems from the recognition of the inadequacy of existing discourses to speak of their own experiences. And this is why the writing often features the reinterpretation of classical myths, the contestation of patriarchal structures, the rewriting of the body as a gendered and therefore as a political entity. So this is kind of as a general introduction. In terms of my own work, my own creative work, my poetry has always been concerned with the notions of time, of place, and of nature. Time and the awareness of the fluidity of time, the recognition of the transitory nature of everything pervades my work as one of my main preoccupations, together with the effects of the passing of time over the physical world, but also over the emotional geographies, the geographies of the self, if you like. So what will remain after all is gone are but ruins, fragments, splinters of time and memory. And just as individual and social memory are constructed following a cumulative process, layer after layer, so writing becomes a sort of palimpsest of memory and experience in which my own poetry is written on the trail of previous utterances and will be in turn written over again. And so the idea of the palimpsest is pretty important as well in my own writing. In relation to place, one of the key poems in my collection Fundaches, which means foundations, is entitled Lugares, places, and it's an attempt to engage with two apparently opposite understandings of place that in my case are not really manifested in opposition, but have instead become a defining part of my personal and my creative makeup. I'm referring to the dynamic relationship that is established between outside places, defined by travel and distance, and inner places, the familiar native soil. Something that the Irish poet Seamus Heaney has labeled as the marriage between the geographical country and the country of the mind. And these are not presented as opposed realities, but rather as kind of a contrapunct, so to speak. Places are not empty. They're charged with meaning and with resonances that may be associated with the past, with one's emotional landscape, and with memory. The identity of places is also linked to language, particularly in countries where there is more or less visible linguistic conflict, such as Galicia. And I'm thinking as well of the importance of place names, of the naming of places as an activity that has pivotal importance both in Galicia and in Ireland. I want now to focus on my collection, Diario de Crosses Green, that was published in 2016, as an exploration of place and nature in relation to all these aspects that I have been talking about. The role of memory, the role of the places of the self and the outside places. As you see on the slide, the collection was translated into English in 2018 by Keith Payne and was published in Francis Bootle Publishers in London. It's a publisher that specializes in minority cultures, and so I think it's very important that the work of Francis Bootle is mentioned here in the context of endangered cultures and ecosystems. This collection is a book that explores the notions of time, place, and nature a book that attempts to apprehend the spirits of a place where I used to live in Cork City, a place called Crosses Green, and the natural spaces all around the River Lee through the changing seasons. And so Crosses Green and Cork City, for those of you who have been here, is defined by the presence of the river, the River Lee, that crosses the city and pretty much defines its geography. So this is a book of urban nature. The different poems in the collection are punctuated by diary entries, hence the title, in which the surrounding landscape is carefully observed and annotated for one entire calendar year. For me, this diary is a laboratory of sorts, kind of a lab of images, but it illuminates the flow of the river and the flow of life that goes with it. And the poems may be poetic responses to life passing by, and the presence of the river is both the metaphor of that passing and the glimpses of real life happening in front of my eyes. So this is the poem that I'm going to read. It's called A Luz dos Días, the light of day, and it tries to capture the essence of that particular landscape, which is both physical, topographical, geographical, if you like, and very specifically located in a very clearly delimited area of the city, but it's also a revelation of the emotional landscape, or if you like, of the inscape, to use Hopkins' idea of the internal kind of inner landscapes. And I want to read this in the context of also of my work on eco-criticism, which is basically about the centrality of nature in our lives, and about ways of analyzing the the rather large cultural production in response to a variety of environmental matters. And so my own poetry is a meditation on issues such as time, place, nature, landscape, memory, belonging, language, and therefore attempts to traffic in cultural biodiversity. So I'm going to read the poem in Galician first, and then in Keith Payne's English translation. A luz dos días. Mentres o mundo se esfarela de redor, arden lonxe as lumaradas do pasado, afúndense as lembranzas dos perdidos momentos que nunca volverán, da friaxe concentrada en albarizas, como nun poema de Uxío Novoneira. Mentres o corazón oculta un tempo roto, do túnel nos recantos máis escuros, un arco da vella escintila nunha ouriza, alí onde mofo e brión tantísimo proliferan, e vibran aterecidas as oucas, a carón da augusta pasaxe dos cisnes. Mentres canta leda a mocidade, nas escadarías que descen cara ao río, construe o estorniño a súa casa baleira baixo as lousas brillantes pola chuvia, entre os laños que abriron ventos agres, nas recónditas fisgoas da lombriga e a sombra. Mentres a tarde espella os rostros devastados da multitude que prega xunto á ponte, baixa coas augas un remuiño de flores, coroas aínda vivas que han iluminar as beiras do recordo, as beiras da morte, as beiras do que fica entre os dedos das mans cando todo remata. Mentres en Crosses Green se esparexe a luz dos días, mentres o ronsel das barcas bagulla na revolta, tremeloz e na rampla respiran cercetas apencadas, tremeloce o sol contra o metal das chemineas, aroman as estancias torradas pradarías, aroman o amor funéreos crisantemos, gris incensario de nardos. The light of day. While the world around crumbles, the lumber of the past burns in the distance, memories of lost moments are drowned and will never surface, as the stinging cold of the bee huts in Uxío Novoneira's poems. While the heart hides the bleak hours in the darkest alcoves under the keys, a rainbow flares on a chestnut fir where the moss and lichen grow, and the crowfoot trembles by the riverbank at the glorious passing of swans, while the children sing lightly on the stone steps to the river. The starling builds its empty nest under the rain-bright roof slates, between the cracks made by bitter winds in the hidden crevices of warmth and shade. While the evening casts the devastated faces of the crowd praying by the bridge, a spray of flowers floats by on the water, leaving reeds that will illuminate the shores of memory, the verge of death, the tip of what's left in your hands when everything ends. While in crosses green the light of day dissolves, as the wake of the boat sweeps through the river bend, the mottled teal rests on the slipway, and the sun shudders against the iron chimneys. Rooms are perfumed from roasted prairies, love perfumed by funereal chrysanthemums, the grey incense of tuberose. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That was beautiful. The Galician was beautiful, and the translation was extraordinary as well.
Thank you very much. Well, the translation is Keith Baines, and he did a beautiful job.
Yeah,
I'm really happy with the way he captured the essence of the place. So,
absolutely, and the rhythm.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, yeah, and this interplay of light and water and shade. It's just amazing. Thank you very much. That's lovely. We'll now go on to our next presenter. So we have Ricardo Fidel Michue Bendezú, whose name I really should be able to pronounce because he is a colleague, Peruvian teaching fellow of Spanish and Castilian, first degree in psychology in Barcelona, Spain, a member of the Adorum of Comunidad Remanucoy, a non-profit group based in London to protect and expand the Quechua language and spread endangered languages. And he's got over 27 years as a teacher of Spanish for undergraduates at all levels. Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you for the invitation. I will start sharing my screen. Yes. Let's see now. Yes. I hope you can view the slides. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ricardo Michue, as Janet mentioned, a teaching fellow of Spanish at this University of Leeds since 1996. I am part of the furniture. I am going to introduce you to the Mexican musical group Maná and its foundation for the health of the environment called Selva Negra, the name. Let me go to slide 2, if it's, I think it's there, no, slide 2. Yes, I think you view the slide 2. Let me know if you.
It's still slide 1 at the moment.
Okay. For some reason I cannot. Okay. Maná, a musical group, is known for its involvement in defending the environment, creator of the Selva Negra Foundation. I should maybe read in Spanish because you have the translation into English there. Okay. Selva Negra, you have at the bottom the translation. Selva Negra actúa en dos frentes. El más importante se dedica a difundir mensajes ecológicos a través de los medios de comunicación, e investiga qué sucede en cada ciudad de los países que están dentro de su proyecto. La otra parte se encarga de generar nuevos proyectos. Let me manage with this screen. Okay. So some things that the foundation has done is, for example, reforestation and planting of 3,700 trees in Cerro de las Cruces, Colombia. Another thing they did is the distribution of envelopes with 3 seeds and their instructions for sowing them during the performance of several concerts in Mexico. And another example of this foundation does is a rescue of nearly 41,000 caguamas turtles on a beach in Puerto Vallarta in Mexico. Okay, this is something that, to illustrate what I have just said on the previous slide, I present my friend, which is an ant. Let me see if I can show you now. I think you can show my ant. Let me know if you can see. ¿Qué pasó con la hormiga? I will link this slide with the next one. And it's a news from 2015. La nueva fiebre del oro arrasa 1.300 kilómetros cuadrados de selva en Sudamérica. La mayor demanda de metal como refugio de los millonarios dispara la deforestación. Okay, the new gold fever sweeps rainforest and its habitat. But the reason, well, the result is the deforestation. Right? But the other reason for example, construction, even you can include here, for example, one of the issues that we are having in Peru, my country, for example, is the drug trafficking. So all is related, and as I mentioned, our friend Ant, the insect is suffering this. You know? Because of the problem of deforestation, the Mana Group created a song. Okay, let's hear that song. And with this, I end my short presentation. Thank you for your attention, and thank you to Jane for organizing this interesting event. I have been traveling to Galicia. I was in Galicia many years. In that part, reminds me Leeds, because sometimes Leeds reminds me Galicia. The climate is rainy, humid, but Galicia is well, warmer, no? And less windy. Okay, let's listen to the song with the slide 6, I hope. And with this, I say, hasta luego. See you later.
Ricardo? Thank you. Would you be able to stop the song now?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That was really interesting. I'd really love to hear more about the environmental group and taking the ant as a symbol of the destruction and what she feels.
Yeah.
I think that's wonderful.
Thank you to you.
Yeah, thank you. So now we're going to go on to Mike Edwards. Mike is Chief Listening Officer at Sound Matters, Listening for a Better World. And he and Harry are going to be speaking to CELCE in June about Sound Matters. He's got over 25 years experience as a sustainability consultant, climate change advisor, and he was appointed climate change advisor to the Elders Foundation, where he provided expert advice to Gro Harlem Brundtland, Kofi Annan and President Jimmy Carter. Mike's also adjunct professor at Holt International Business School, an honorary research associate at University College London, and a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. But for today, he's also a musician and is considered one of the world's most accomplished contemporary didgeridoo players, having performed at festivals around the world, and he's released 4 CDs to international acclaim. Mike has asked that attendees use headphones because we're going to be playing a recording and it's going to be best listened to through headphones. Mike.
Thank you, Janet. Yeah, if you haven't got headphones, don't worry, because you don't need to all go running off. Thank you so much for that introduction. One thing I'm definitely not is a poet. So it's lovely to be here in some sort of capacity. I'm going to be quick because that'll allow us to maybe make up a little bit of time so we can have time for discussion. All my work has been around this whole idea of trying to connect human and more than human worlds, and that's what I'm fascinated by, and that's why with my sound and with my music I try to create that sort of connection. In this poem, it was written a while back, and it was basically an exploration into Aboriginal notions of country. I lived in Australia for many years, and one thing I was fascinated by was sort of the connection that some Aboriginal people had to land, to stories, animals, plants, landscapes, whatever it might be. And it was something I felt that was thoroughly missing in my life. The problem is, for a lot of urban Aboriginal people, there's a separation that's occurring. And so this poem tries to explore what that separation actually means, and in a sense, what it sounds like. And I've tried to weave into this narrative sort of my own desperate search for connection. If I read through what I've written over the years, it's kind of a lament at just this deep sense of separation from pretty much everything. And the reason I took up the didgeridoo was because it connected me to the land. And interestingly, wherever I've played it around the world, it's connected me to landscape. And so I suppose what I've tried to do here is bring those sort of narratives together. I don't know whether it's poetry, there's some didgeridoo, there's some words, and I hope you enjoy it. And again, thank you so much for inviting me.
He clasps VB heaven to his heaving chest as babies crawl around his legs. His movements synchronized with swaying train. Offspring chirp like fledglings fallen from their nest. He is a proud man living an urban tradition. Ties to culture severed like limbs from amputee. One wonders how these bright young eyes will find their way. Will they lose their footing between glass stalagmites? Will they trace their loneliness through the songlines of furrowed brow? What future for us and them? These are the forgotten souls who have stories to sing. They are the flotsam, the detritus left by waves of progress in heaving seas. They, as we, lost in a universe of shallow stars, surviving on the precipice of longevity. The tunnel is dark. They'd have us believe this story, the narrative of knots that bind. The morning star still burns as vision turns to gold. There is life in sand and bark. The continuum of the drone, creating the cycle which brings death to life. Their song will always dance, perhaps on tired wings, levitating above the shallow dreams of those who create traps. Time for fire, the drone of hope. Sing the songs that tell of ancestors who cried this land. The hollow tree, the spirit that resides, waiting for the breath that brings life to land. The owners know the tracks. They were precipitated by voice. Voices that have silenced, that we cannot hear. Listen. Listen, for that is the song of creation.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was really moving.
Pleasure.
And this idea of separation, which we've actually seen in the last three poems, separation through time, separation from place, the deforestation that we saw earlier. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I'd now like to introduce my friend and colleague, Sam Liebhaber, who's Associate Professor of Arabic at Middlebury College in Vermont, in the States. He got his PhD in Arabic literature from the University of California, and he's spent several periods of studying Arabic and research in Yemen, as lived in Sana'a, Aden and Al-Ghaiba. He worked with the poet Bob Holman to publish a translation of Dr. Abdulaziz Maqala's Kitab Sana'a, the Book of Sana'a, in 2004, and a translation of the first written collection of poetry in the endangered Mehri language of Eastern Yemen, the Diwan of Hajj Darkon. And he's recently published a digital exhibit of Mehri poetry, from which from which the poem that he's going to be talking about today will come. And the title of his presentation is Emotion Unfolded, Natural Vignettes in Mehri Poetry. Andrea, I think you're going to be sharing the slides, aren't you?
Well, thank you so much, Janet, for the introduction, and thank you to the folks at the CELCE for organizing this event. And also a special shout out to, of course, Janet and Miranda and Kamala and Orhan and everyone else who has supported me and this research along the way. So thank you very much. I'll be talking today about the way in which nature serves as sort of the raw material for metaphor in the poetry and the poetic traditions of the Mehri language. Of course, metaphor serves to enable an articulation and an expression of thoughts and emotional landscapes that that are impossible for sort of our day-to-day language to properly express. So nature, at least in Mehri poetry, is where emotion resides. It's where highly complicated thoughts and feelings reside as well. I think what I'd like to do, though, is jump right to the poem itself and perhaps leave the contextual information for the end of the presentation, or if there's any time afterwards. So Andrea, if you don't mind, maybe we can sort of advance to the second slide here. And just very quickly, this poem is sort of an extended historical narrative about a conflict between two groups of people, and it centers around the actions of a certain Sa'dit, a man whose parentage extends to both sides of this conflict. Sa'dit himself was well known across Al-Mahara as a remarkable marksman, as a sharpshooter. He could hit anything. In fact, one of the people that I worked with in translating this poem into Arabic recalls driving with Sa'dit and seeing him make an incredible shot from a moving truck. So in any case, the Sa'dit is again, remembered for his skills as a sharpshooter. So in this particular conflict, we'll see it ends with him sniping his adversaries, but only hitting their headscarves, their head wraps, not aiming to hurt them. Because again, they were adversaries on one hand, but they're also his cousins as well. So this first side sort of sets out the basic incident that sort of propels this narrative forward. So we find that there's a ceasefire between these two groups has ended, and things are heading to an inevitable showdown between the two groups. Rumors are flying, and a fellow named Saeed, who's some sort of like influencer within one of the groups, decides that action must be taken. So the metaphor that's used here is the field has sprouted. And so this comes up in sort of line 2 of this poem. And by the way, the poem itself is much longer. I've only sort of extracted those portions of it to sort of illustrate what I'd like to talk about today. You can actually find the full text of the poem on a document that I've shared with Janet and Andrea, so they can either share with the participants here or perhaps upload it to the chat. But to return back to the text of the poem itself, the field has sprouted. So I'd like us to hold on to that image, because it's actually going to come back again later in the poem. So here we find, far from this being sort of a bucolic image, this field is is expressing the fact that sort of conditions are ripe for war. The harvest is ready. So if Andrea, if you could advance to the next slide here. Yeah, so moving forward, we get sort of the crisis point in the poem. So here we have another fellow named Salome, who appears to be some sort of war leader within the group of combatants. And here we find his troops, the people who join up with him to go sort of, harass the other side, are described in a way that likens them to his herd of camels. So he's leading them along, and they are sort of surrounding and follow him. And so while they're kind of, scouting out the land, they come across somebody from the other group whose name is Selim. And they grab him and they sort of throw him to the ground. And at first, Selim is thinking that this might be a joke, that it's not entirely serious, but then the reality dawns on him, and he realizes that he's been captured by the other side, and bad things are going to happen to him. This is not going to end well for Selim, and he's rightfully terrified. And I expect that Salome and his cohort, while at one hand, feeling very excited to have, captured their prey, are also probably, and are filled with, adrenaline and excitement, are also engaged in something that probably causes them, a sense of at least, worry and concern. So here's sort of the crisis moment in the poem. And then this leads to our first sort of nature-based vignette, in which all of the emotions that are coming out in this scene get depicted in metaphoric terms that derive from the natural environment. So if Andrea, if we could move on to that, wonderful. So here we have sort of our first vignette. So we have their thirsty camels drank their fill and drank pure water, and then took off for their hills. It's a little jarring to come across these sudden transitions from sort of straightforward narrative to this type of metaphorical vignette. And in fact, the reason why I chose this poem to talk about today is because there are a number of these sort of jarring transitions from narrative to this sort of these metaphoric vignettes. And in speaking to my consultants, folks who helped me understand this poem, they too had trouble understanding what exactly this vignette, how it actually works within the poem. They understand it to be significant, but in terms of sort of articulating what it's about, oftentimes had trouble doing so. But at the same time, we all agreed it's an amazing and excellent poem. So this talk is really sort of an exploration of why we feel so strongly about this poem, that it's an excellent one, while at the same time recognizing that there's a lot of enigmas in it. So here we have these thirsty camels drinking their fill, and insofar as we've heard sort of Salome's group described as a group of camels, maybe they're sort of gathered around Selim. He's sort of the well, and they're extracting information from him. They're sort of drawing out his essence. Again, it's actually, there's an element of brutality in this scene. And then they take off, and we find these camels are also experiencing fear at the same time. And again, I can't help but to feel that there's almost a connection between Selim, who's being captured, and Salome and his group that's doing the interrogation. There's this shared sense, I think, of fear and terror. They're doing something maybe unnatural. There's a sense of almost sort of self-loathing at what they're doing. And this is sort of articulated through that next line, line 19, like the ocean when it is angry, waves follow upon wave, over the reefs, the ocean rolls. Again, this surging, powerful emotion. Now, I've never been in a scrap or a brawl like they're describing, but I expect that the type of sort of adrenaline fueled sort of rage and anger and excitement and fear and terror is all mixed together. And it's very difficult to, I think, articulate that in sort of our day-to-day normal language during these moments, these sort of exceptional moments that happen. And then suddenly the metaphoric language switches back to our camels. Here are the raging she-camels that are looking on this field that has produced all this growth, the vegetables, everything the camels want to eat, and they're desperate to get at it. And the camels themselves are raging at the garden. Again, you know, I suspect here this is like the group, you know, Salam's group gathering around. They want to sort of continue. They're filled with battle rage and bloodlust, and again, just very, very powerful, disturbing emotion is being represented in these vignettes. So Andrea, if we could advance one more slide. Yeah, so then we sort of move along to sort of the climax of the tale. We leave aside Salome and Selim, and we go back to, we introduce Saadit. So I think Selim calls for help. Somehow news gets out that Selim has been captured. And so Saadit joins up and gathers his kin, and they go to sort of stage a raid on the other side, and they're sort of sniping down from the mountain on their adversaries. And this is just sort of a very exciting, sort of straightforward, you know, narrative here. The rams kneeled with their rifles in order to shoot their new bullets, fresh from the factory, with the fire that is strong and continuous from the rapid action of the firing pin and the clicking of the trigger. They know well the rifle sights and are experts at taking aim when the bullets whiz by. So here again, we have that sort of that characteristic talent of Saadit is really coming to the fore here. Again, the preeminent marksman of Al-Mahra. So if Andrea, if we want to continue to the next slide. And then finally we end up, and this is again, what I find really remarkable at this poem is really, these are the last, 8 lines or so of the poem. Things suddenly shift. So we go from this excitement-filled battle to sort of this denouement, where the poet's voice suddenly shifts. And we find, in line 36, the conventional invocation to this type of public-facing, historical, epic poem. And now, Odiwa Karim Karim, when the melodies gather, a reservoir that can't be emptied by scooping. So here we have poetic talent, poetic genius described as a reservoir or a well that is constantly replenished. It can never be emptied. And that this well is sought after, this reservoir, by the moving animal herds. And of course, this echoes back to that earlier description of the well. In this case, the water that the she-camels were extracting in this very sort of different context of fighting and violence. Here it sublimates differently as a metaphor for poetic genius. And then we have this sense of sort of migrating water, or else the herds that migrate to find this water. And then this sort of imaginary correlative suddenly sort of pivots to another migrating aspect. That is to say that the poetic muse that travels across the desert, that travels from person to person. So you can see the way there's sort of these logical connections, these pivot points that the poet can sort of spin around from sort of the well to a migrating herd, to the migrating muse, and then finally to the place itself, Wadi Geza, where this action is taking place. And then in the last 3 lines, suddenly everything changes. The tone changes, the description changes, and we find a gazelle that's wandering around, the gazelle who roams the land by herself in the desolate waste. So she's all by herself. She's known the hunter when the wind blows back and forth, when she smells his sweat. She takes off at a run until she has disappeared, and her head has completely disappeared. So the last few lines end on this very, very enigmatic note. But I think if we are open to the metaphoric language of Mehri poetry, as well as some of the sort of the circumstances around it, we recognize it as a perfect summation of sort of the basic theme of this poem. That is to say, Saadit, the preeminent huntsman, the marksman, this is his signature in these last few lines. It's describing, it's encapsulating him, his perfect essence as this hunter, while at the same time we have this, it's, you know, written from the perspective of a desert gazelle, that is the quarry that's running away, which also sort of ties together those earlier images we came across of Salome depicted as a quarry running away, or as camels fleeing as well, being pursued by something. So even though these last few lines don't appear, you know, in terms of sort of straightforward logic as being related to anything, we find that it's about this relationship between hunter and quarry, hunter and prey, and in particular Sa'adit, you know, sort of the great marksman. So it really is sort of a wonderful way that sort of it kind of brings the poem all together. You know, I'm not sure to what degree this type of metaphoric logic is conscious at the time of poetic creation. But at the same time, I think, you know, the poetry in El Mahara and elsewhere as well, you know, you have these incredibly complicated at times where, you know, these moments of incredibly powerful emotion that really bedevil the power of day-to-day language to express. So you sort of have to rely on these, this sort of metaphoric language, these vignettes to get across what you're trying to say. And of course, if you're familiar with the pre-Islamic Arabic poetic tradition, which is closely related, or not, I shouldn't say closely related, but it sort of shares a number of features with the Mehri tradition, as well as later sort of, you know, the Qasida tradition in Arabic, you'll recognize this use of vignettes as a way of articulating powerful, inexpressible emotion and logic. So at the end, when I would ask, you know, folks I was working with, what does this mean? And they couldn't respond. I realized I was asking an absurd question, because the point is what the folks are feeling in these lines can't be expressed. They can't be described in sort of day-to-day language. You need metaphoric language. You need vignettes to get across what you're trying to say. So that's the whole point of them, is you can't talk about them outside of this poetic language. So I think I'll stop there. And then again, if there are any questions about sort of the Mehri language and poetry where it's spoken, I'm happy to take those questions later. So thank you. Oh, I actually have, Janet, do we have 1 minute? Because I do have a recording of this poem that maybe we could listen to a minute or so of it, if we have, or even just a couple lines of it. Again, actually, and tying back to some of the comments earlier, this is a sung poem. There's the distinction between sort of poetry and singing is a completely, it just doesn't exist in the poetic traditions of Southern Arabia.
I think we'll be okay. We will carry on this workshop for longer than the one last week in order to have a proper discussion time, if that's okay with participants.
So Andrea, do you mind, actually, there's the website that I sent you the link for.
Yeah, I've got it set up here. Do you want the website on the screen, or do you want the PowerPoint?
The website itself, and maybe we could just listen to 10 or 15 seconds of the recording.
Can you see it now?
Yes, I can. There's that little,
okay.
Yeah.
Do you want me to start right at the beginning?
Sure. Yeah. It starts right in. Stop there, I think.
Thank you. Putting my video on. Thank you very much, Sam. That was really interesting. How these vignettes work and the oceans. And when you were talking about when the poet talks about the raging oceans, I was thinking of the camels. The ocean's angry. The camels being raging like an ocean. Right, we'll go on to Tim Thurston. is lecturer in Chinese studies. His research focuses on traditional and emerging oral cultures of ethnic minorities in the People's Republic of China, with an emphasis on Tibetans. And his current research seeks to theorize cultural sustainability as a response to some of the drawbacks of intangible cultural heritage safeguarding. Tim.
Well, first of all, thank you all for this. This has been really fascinating just to listen to so much poetry from all around the globe. I guess I'll be talking today about sort of some of the work that I've been doing in Tibet, and working particularly, I've got two things that I'm going to try and place together very quickly. First is traditional poetry of praises of a place called Thurston, and then also hip hop, much more contemporary, obviously. So basically the pieces that I'm looking at today are both from the northeastern Tibetan region of Tibet known as Amdo, which is in contemporary sort of Qinghai, Sichuan, Gansu provinces. It's sort of over the Tibetan borderlands. Can you close the door? But I mean, this is just one of three major ethno-linguistic regions of Tibet. It's sort of Amdo is sort of known as the region of scholars in Tibet, whereas Uzang is the land of religion. It's where Lhasa, the capital, is. Kham is the land of the warriors, and Amdo is the land of scholars. Very quickly thinking about our theme of sort of endangerment and language and cultures and ecosystems, it's worth pointing out that that all three of these are in their own ways sort of under threat in the Tibetan region. Language, education, Chinese state education policies and other things have served to sort of facilitate language shift, so that younger generations in many cases aren't as familiar with Tibetan language. And even when they are, the traditional registers and idioms are a little bit new to many younger generations. Despite this, though, there is an impressive amount of Tibetan language media, film, television, film, television, literature, all sorts of things. Ecosystems, one of the big things we notice is that there's a story of Tibet as being sort of this harsh wasteland, a no man's land. But from a Tibetan perspective, it's also a life-sustaining region. It's the water tower of Asia, with sort of the major, the three of the major, of all of Asia's major rivers sort of find their headwaters on the Tibetan plateau. It's also obviously known for its tremendous mountain ranges, and most importantly, the Himalayan mountain ranges. But then it's also a region facing serious concerns about desertification. Finally, culturally, we talk about sort of there are both religious and secular traditions, many of them under threat, again, as children and as younger generations spend more time in state schools and away from lands that and parts of the community that have transmitted these cultural practices for generations, in many cases for centuries. But often these are related to language nature. So I'm going to be sort of just playing two pieces from it. The first is called Thurston, and what I've done is I've put the Tibetan on the left, the English on the right. I'm going to play the piece. I'm not going to read it to you, and I'm just going to sort of let it go through. And hopefully I've done everything right. I think I checked share system audio. If you don't hear a sound in the next like 15 seconds, just somebody shout.
야, 다스 카와르비 마치치 용서스쿠르기 예전다다 차프르튼 도르물 사이틀리 서종 아연던 시모 파이어 셴거 선도피 예종들라 토파남 숨레조나 야, 다스 손장 갈랑가 대와 건카미 남에스쿠르기 상카미 가장도상 고에르 공탄냠사 소라슨 켜크르멜로 냐스르미 khsonjil ngomsa 리데미르 스타트르 독사 자모코 공탄냠브르 도르므르 라스타 아트사 Rarasır tıgla darsa nıga jarzon davlu orantul tanzam tıktıklir jisa. Le devi langsor jisa. Pungo mu gaye melon san dav çıkı vaygan jisa. Sonya mu ngla kersa. Ya tata ne ogestan chichi choka chen don garang da dosa. Ma simchin dela kosa. Wan dortul mai choka marchen de sijin zamsa. Le jemde shanga jasa man don kum tai choka tando yi tika kansa. Kyo bomi muganga yorsa. 야, 다들 말하는 나도 산동금 사이스팅 크로저 정라 아롱미도 저마차 넘이가 이제 아니 신진 청와다 그런다. 근데 파일러 신호가 되어 있는 이제샤게. 야, 다들 어딘데 이 저와 남성소 주사기나 니 하나 아마 고무 어다 놓고 여지 좀 단다. 러신진 살아 아랑 코스타 카리어 답라 아랑 코. 니 로나 아니 역사총 사고피 손질 몸사. 어거먹고 코스마데미 치카리 리라조사 니놈나 딱그라 펜슨 qalagrum gozanlachimda chamnoqi sinin joli xil marun chamla papsa ndesana zunkrsteri ardikari urgunlatığında la karşı zunkurun zomi rdi javi yertan bakjonsa ya tandi oyun arzar bu tazi xo pensin tertan bir şingar delon tasili metozanda Adindala University Chergambi Cetransa, Lozombi Dablar Jesa, Mami Hamdan Karsa, Chergamba Kikriota, Sonzombra Samchon Dansa, Chekari Stamba, Aktanla Zosa, Mata Kamatal Mania Dosa, Lamata Tawan Dansa, Tirjambra Limdesa, Makivi Lorgi Jesa, Lirgeti Langsol Zosa, Standovi Tekakansa, Likan Ordemi, Sanlor Demsi, the Tomi Nakalo Sarkar Oma Sotrchersa, Liankra Wakanjamsa, Wakachtan Tanyamsa. 야, 다닥스음 시킨 쪽사 아야스음 메토자사. 그tonsum driver jesa argensum kavir jansa. Tejembra nawa jesa sakasik sonyen 쪽사. Asikarna khakil jesa nangi lolgamensa. Dargitin doyi monsa khwazodin servicen kul. Chindon nyamunsa li tokir chiwo tonsa. Chok kom suxtikta karsa lirgezer gewa jembra dosa. Karu jamsa dansa dil maron chamla pausa. Je javi kwalon tsasa marchiu organization varma sayin do shikalıksa. Sayang zum şinga delo enezire şage.
Gottenche a. So that's the first one, and I'll sort of briefly discuss afterwards. I'll sort of compare the two, but one thing one might notice, so Tibetan society, Buddhist societies have this sort of form of meditative art called the mandala, and one of the big things we see in this is sort of a mandalization of Tibetan space, where this one village is placed in the center of the Buddhist mandala, in the center of the Tibetan religious world, and in doing so, it becomes itself a holy place. I've written an article, you guys can find it, I won't belabor the point. Compare this with its sort of more traditional form of considering and discussing the natural world with an example of Tibetan hip hop. And this one is called Zamba. And before we get into it, what you need to know is Zamba is the Tibetan staple food. It is so prevalent in Tibet that when Tibetans created their own sign language, they used the action of mixing Zamba into your staple food as the example of, as the word for Tibetans. And Tibetans call themselves the Zamba eaters. That's one of their epithets for themselves. So without any further ado, this is MC Buddhist.
야, 오늘 갈라와 책비 디스크블라 또 야동 소탕 양포니. 우선 님들 호무 상식이 때문에 호미 장कर 삼바다. 나오도 초섬 소위 템프르는 호미 양천 다이시. 야, 다시 제 땅마 장कर 신축은 종수 나지 님보 등 리체 도치는 만땅 쳐. 당고는 오빠 소름 치 신축은 대땅 담을 거 동춘 판스마 디퍼 거. 나타키 샤양 아지 저지가 세르제.
야동 소탕 샹의 님들 호무 쇼바 메디 쇼바요. 当初搞不更替的为口味验证跟了装的就该用了谁不生气给的不讲您的手头提出你没帮你投入也给通话的这段广播让你学会确认没得对一的我觉得咱们能够走到这种准我的咱们是我把错您的手头更进没得命了更进我没拉个人您的手头提出他一破年赢了没生看我能赢您的手头破瑞萨拉整个三比这行切切木不没有竞配您的手头我比萨拉整个三比这行他想没生看我起了秀您的我没冲杀冲杀Gasa gasa lewu, gona uchi pasa, chesa lewu, junker zambi teshim, gasa gasa lewu, junker zambi teshim, gasa lewu, nindi bomi chungsa 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 gasa lewu. 着我迷倒几个人拿酒瓶拿灯拿得个劲我那个三人更近我迷着比着把些马蹄怕一了卡特别强等我的师傅等的人拉我学他没了用啊年里边的这个因那用力气下力气上那个马蹄不拉马克先比人就马头年里边的这因那用您着我迷熊哇马别的因拉送等些难度整个三比挂真马别的因拉送等些难度
Yeah, so I'm going to stop there just for interest of time, but a couple of points that are, well, I was going to stop there for the interest of time. So a couple of thoughts just to sort of finish it, to round this off. Firstly, what you might notice in that video is, so now we have, I mean, it's actually sort of a feast of sort of these images of Tibet, so that the festival was something from the sort of Eastern Tibetan region called Kham. The rapper himself and the speech that was being given at the beginning was from Northeastern Tibet, Amdo, and the song that sort of provides the beat and the chorus are from Central Tibet and Western Tibet. And so this is something where instead of doing something where it's just about Amdo, now this is turning it into using the environment, the natural world, as a site of building nationalism. So these are just two examples from much broader traditions. And I mean, I've chosen oral poetry because that's my space in which I like to work. But there are, I mean, I should not obscure the fact that there are also tremendous written cultures. Let's see. There are tremendous written cultures of poetry with natural imagery as well. All right, here. So epistemic natural imagery. This was the one point I wanted to say is that, so you might have noticed that the imagery itself is very different from the more traditional to the more modern version. And it's sort of indicative of major epistemic shifts in contemporary Tibetan expressive practices, where the way of dealing with the environment and of portraying the environment is changing in this time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was fantastic. Some wonderful comments in the chat. We'll now go on to, yes, I don't know what you're called. I'll get your name later, but we'll perhaps meet you. So we'll now go on to Mary Mulholland. She's a London-based poet with poems published in a range of magazines, most recently Snakeskin, Perverse, London Grip, Amber and Under the Radar. And she was shortlisted in the Trim, Ascetica and Buzzwords, commended in Winchester and Artlist competitions, and she's twice been a winner in the Poetry Society members competitions. So Mary, I'll hand over to you. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you so much. And hello everyone. It's a wonderful and really rich afternoon. So, oh sorry, I think you received the wrong email. Can you just move it up so you just get the plantation? Sorry, Andrea, could you move up the text so you just have the poem, please? Thank you. Okay, so this is what I'm going to offer you this afternoon is a very personal account of using poetry to explore my own narrative, which has a much wider relevance regarding migration, belonging, and our ultimate belonging to the earth. I grew up knowing my mother came from BG, British Guiana, subsequently Guyana. I knew her family were originally Portuguese who emigrated from Madeira in the first half of the 19th century, but not knowing why they went there, nor why they eventually moved to England, nor why they decided to abandon their language. My journey to find out more led me to discover about indenture and family shame. Following the abolition of slavery on the sugar plantations around 1835, indentured labour was brought in, and a little known fact of Caribbean history is that the first indentured labour was Portuguese. Madeira was the only place in Europe that grows sugarcane, and the island was suffering from severe droughts. So between 1835 till about 20 years later, about 40,000 Madeirans were shipped to Guyana, and of these about 70% died from malnutrition or disease. Although my mother told us stories about her childhood, she kept a lot hidden. My research reveals her father, my grandfather, who was the son of the indentured great-grandparents, had a dream to change the rigidly segregated society of Guyana. He left school with only a junior certificate, but studied night after working as a clerk and became a barrister by 31, entered politics, a colourful figure frequently in the papers and cartoons, Fernand's the Fearless, trying to take on the status quo, then dying at 38 in very mysterious circumstances prior to the major constitutional changes which he had vehemently opposed. Reading the Georgetown Chronicle and other newspapers was my source for information my mother wouldn't share. The art of daydreaming. My mother has sugarcane blood. She's made of mango. She is pineapple. Dresses in laughter, passes darkness to her big-boned daughter to wear. Sometimes my beautiful mother sings as she peels potatoes. Her voice is alto. When she tries soprano, she is a spider monkey. My beautiful mother's rings are loose on her fingers. She believes rubies and gold will bring her good luck. She likes to lose herself in dreams. She gazes beyond the garden, a capuchin in the rhododendron. She hears tree frogs in the ticking of the grandfather clock. And had I not gone to that Almodovar film that I didn't enjoy, I'd have answered her call, not heard her voice later, too late to call back, naming me in her sing-song way as if saying goodbye. Sometimes we just get it wrong. That night I was too big-bone dumb. By next morning, my beautiful mother is wading back to childhood, ankle-deep in warm rain. My mother is an Amazonian water lily, afloat on dark water. Her petals unfurl like paper decoration. She doesn't see the caiman's amber eyes waiting, a green anaconda dangling from a branch, the harpy eagle that'll soar her to the canopy's green mantle. My mother doesn't like green. Her breathing is the ocean. She is rushing in to pause on the Demerara silt shore, then rushing out to rejoin the horizon. Her waves are thrashing the seawall. She's wearing foam lace, ribboning the air with clouds that shift, turning electric blue. My butterfly mother is sky. Yeah, thank you very much. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was fantastic. Thank you. Right, I will now introduce our last presenter and poet, Rob Miles. So Rob Miles is from Devon and lives in Leeds. He studied at Leeds, Languages, Literature and Culture, and did a PhD on the cinema of Victor Erais. He's published in academic journals on Erais, Pablo Picasso, and Seamus Heaney, various other people. He's taught translation, Hispanic and visual cultural studies at the University of Leeds, Portsmouth, Hull and Liverpool, and he currently teaches film in Liverpool. Rob's poetry has appeared widely in anthologies and magazines, including Ambit, Poetry Wales, Orbis, The Interpreter's House, Stand, South Bank Poetry, and he's won various competitions, including the Philip Larkin Prize, the Resurgence International Eco Poetry Prize, and the Poets and Players Prize. Thank you very much, Rob. I pass the floor over to you.
Not at all, thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Technicals first, yeah? Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to share screen and I'll go straight through these. No, I won't give big introductions or anything, and we're a bit short on time, so I'll just go through these. But just to say, really, when I was asked to do this, I'm sure this happened with other people, but my mind went in 1,000 different directions thinking about all of the interconnections. And I started thinking a little bit more since the last one, really about the body and some of the ironies about, which we've already mentioned today, actually, things relating to things like consolation, that we go to nature for consolation sometimes, but the great horrible irony, and I'm sure this has happened previously in other endangered, that's the cultures, or threatened cultures, that's all up for debate as well, as we've seen from the chat today. But this irony that we go perhaps to nature for consolation, and actually it's nature that we're potentially mourning or troubled by, and so on. So my collection, this selection here, this is the 3 poems that I want to look at and share with you, are British. They're about the British Isles. I'm not in any way talking about English as a threatened language, although it's really they're sort of personal moments of encounter, and really thinking broadly and thematically about questions of inclusion and exclusion, the things that we treasure and the things that we dread, and this idea of us somehow being an island, but not just geographically, but also perhaps culturally, or in perhaps recently in terms of our history and so on. I was also thinking about a kind of inversion about the British Isles as the water and everything else is the land, that moment where we reflect, where we actually see ourselves, maybe see all the way to the bottom, see some of the darker things, see what's whipped up on the surface and all of those things. But I'm going to start with something, it's kind of light, but when I did the research, it couldn't be light in the end. I don't want to, no spoilers, but this is just about puffins. What are you, puffin, if not our prodigal punk? Underground and smuggling nothing, then for years you'll wing it, piercing and weaving through wave under wave as much as above. Late last spring, your folks were Mayfair billionaires, burrowing. No pool or gym, but one cracking Fabergé permitted, and out pops a puffling looking knackered already in a knee-length fur. You've no plectrum-shaped face, nor proper orange swimming fins yet. Though up and down you'll plod, meaning serious business in someone else's flip-flops, yes, you're getting the eye. Each worried iris in its tiny triangle, that symbol of providence on the back of a $1 bill, like the secret of your own bill's counterfeit shades exposed one psychoactive day under ultraviolet, bright as a barbecue brick. In daylight, at a distance, Great circuses of you become flung crockery, whole shelves of Clarice Cliff, flying from cliffs, wild fragments crushing back to land, legs wide as a clown off a slide, for more kinky beak butting, clocking up the molecules with a kiss. There are myths too, of a culinary kind. Your heart's dished up raw, so it's told. And while you should grow old in old Puffin's homes, you can't grow tall or cast vast fishing lines, and so you wash ashore in scores, wasting away with the ice, down to its own last bones. The next poem began life as a kind of love poem, but then it just became collective. As you do, I was reading, I think, a medical article, and it was really about testing for paralysis and needles and devices used in those zones of the body that where we detect sensation or not, and how things are phenomenally, so fascinatingly joined up. And really, again, following on from what we discussed last week about this idea of the body and in relation to language and response. And I was speaking to someone not long ago actually about translation and knowing even when a translation has worked. And we were talking about how it can almost be physical. There's a physical response, like you've cracked it, like when the draft of a poem first sort of comes out, sometimes when it's working semi-consciously, sometimes when a translation's really good, you kind of know there's a moment when the key is turned. But this is really about recent politics to a certain extent, in which you don't realize until you've done it, until the poem is out. Zones of exclusion. Where do we reckon the deadening starts? Is it below the navel or somewhere above the heart? What test could serve beyond the neural byways, the pins in maps of connection or inaction? Gathering where paths have numbed, at which points whole parts of us become closed down to others. And the last poem is it's kind of the exotic staring back at us, and it's kind of ironic, the things that we capture and treasure and put away for observation, and the things that we reject, but the sense of being stared back at in an unnerving and knowing way. Captivity. Cut from her stride, she is knuckle-rooted, fist steadied on all fours. The belly of her slung M flexes upward, inward, and holds. Her arms have the girth of old jetty pilings, fur like woken iron filings, unmoved juggernaut. She sniffs the dead eye of the lens, twitches her wide black heart within black heart, its hard-won symmetries stirred, then firm again, like drying tar. She burns air with a stare. With a blink, she lets go her grip on our turning world. Everything is caught. Thank you very much. I look forward to conversation.
Thank you very much, Rob. They were beautiful poems.